It was the crowning night of Arthur's life, the exact moment his relentless ambition was supposed to pay off. Standing in the grand ballroom of the Pierre Hotel, a bespoke tuxedo clinging to his shoulders and his glamorous new fiancée on his arm, he waited for the elusive CEO of the Kensington Group to take the stage. Securing this account meant an automatic partnership at his firm. He had spent months chasing the ghost-like billionaire behind the empire. But when the spotlight finally hit the podium, the breath violently left Arthur's lungs. The billionaire stepping up to the microphone wasn't some ruthless, silver-haired tycoon. It was Brianna, his plain, coupon-clipping, unassuming ex-wife. And she was looking right at him. Arthur Sterling had always believed that a man was only as successful as the woman standing next to him. When he first met Brianna at a coffee shop near Northwestern University, he found her endearing. She was draped in oversized, knitted sweaters, her hands perpetually stained with charcoal or clay, and she possessed a quiet, grounded warmth that provided a sanctuary from his high-stress finance courses. 10 years later, however, Arthur no longer saw a sanctuary. He saw a dead weight. At 34, Arthur was a senior director at Blackwood and Finch, a premier wealth management firm in downtown Seattle. He wore $3,000 Tom Ford suits, drove a leased Porsche 911, and obsessively tracked his social capital. Brianna, on the other hand, had not changed. She remained a middle school art teacher who drove a battered 2012 Subaru Outback with a missing hubcap. She shopped at thrift stores, bought store-brand groceries, and stubbornly refused to attend his corporate dinners, claiming the atmosphere felt stiff and insincere. "You could at least buy a new dress, Bea," Arthur had snapped one Tuesday evening, watching her mend a tear in a faded Patagonia fleece. David Prescott is hosting a summer soiree at his Mercer Island estate. The partners will be there. The wives will be wearing Oscar de la Renta and Prada. You cannot show up in something you bought off a clearance rack at Nordstrom Rack. Brianna hadn't looked up from her sewing. "The people at your firm don't care about me, Arthur. They care about what you can do for their portfolios. My dress won't change your quarterly returns." "It's about image," he had yelled, the frustration boiling over. "It's about projecting success. How can I convince high-net-worth individuals to trust me with their millions when my own wife looks like she belongs in a soup kitchen line?" Brianna finally stopped sewing. She looked at him, her hazel eyes unreadable, completely devoid of the hurt he expected. "If my appearance is jeopardizing your fragile illusion of success, Arthur, perhaps you should go alone." He did go alone, and that was the night he truly noticed Victoria Ashford. Victoria was the newly appointed Vice President of Public Relations at Blackwood and Finch. She was everything Brianna was not: sleek, cutthroat, flawlessly polished, and fluent in the language of luxury. She wore Cartier Panthers on her wrists and knew exactly which vintage of Bordeaux to order to impress a client. When Arthur stood by the infinity pool at his boss's estate, nursing a scotch and feeling the sting of his wife's absence, Victoria slid up beside him, smelling of Baccarat Rouge 540. "Drinking alone, Sterling?" she purred, her eyes tracing his jawline. Where's the elusive Mrs. Sterling? Still boycotting the bourgeoisie? She wasn't feeling well, Arthur lied smoothly, clinking his glass against hers. "Pity," Victoria whispered, stepping just a fraction of an inch too close. "A man on your trajectory needs a partner who understands the altitude, not someone terrified of heights." That conversation sparked a clandestine, 6-month affair. With Victoria, Arthur felt invincible. They spent weekends in boutique hotels in Vancouver, dining at Michelin-starred restaurants, plotting their ascents to the top of the corporate food chain. Victoria didn't just understand his ambition, she stoked it. She convinced him that he was destined for greatness, and that Brianna was the only anchor dragging him down to mediocrity. The decision to end his marriage didn't come with tears or agonizing guilt. It came with the cold, calculated logic of a business transaction. Brianna was an underperforming asset. It was time to divest. He broke the news on a rainy Sunday morning. Brianna was at the kitchen island of their modest Queen Anne home, calmly sipping Earl Grey tea and reading a paperback novel. Arthur stood in the doorway, his stomach tight, rehearsing the speech he and Victoria had crafted. "Bea, we need to talk," he began, his voice rigid. "I'm not happy. We aren't happy. We're moving in completely different directions." Brianna slowly closed her book, marking the page with a torn piece of paper. "Different directions," she repeated softly. "You mean you want to keep climbing, and you feel I'm holding the ladder too close to the ground? I need a partner who shares my vision for the future." Arthur pushed on, leaning against the doorframe to project confidence. "I'm filing for divorce. I've already spoken to a lawyer. I want this to be amicable, Bea. We can make it clean." He braced himself for the hysterics. He expected her to cry, to beg, to throw her mug at the wall, or perhaps demand half of the substantial savings he had spent years accumulating. Instead, Brianna simply took another sip of her tea, her expression eerily serene. "Clean is fine," she said quietly. "Have your lawyer send the papers to Evelyn Carmichael. She'll handle it on my end." Arthur frowned, thrown off balance by her terrifying lack of emotion. "Evelyn Carmichael? Who is that? Just use my guy, Cobb. We don't need to waste money fighting over this. I'll make sure you get a fair settlement to help you find a new apartment." A faint, almost imperceptible smile ghosted across Brianna's lips. "I prefer my own counsel, Arthur. And don't worry about my living arrangements. I'll be perfectly fine." The divorce proceedings were the easiest Arthur's attorney, William Cobb, had ever witnessed. In fact, it was so easy that Cobb felt compelled to warn Arthur that something might be wrong. "I've been in family law for 30 years, Arthur," Cobb grunted, leaning back in his leather chair, a thick file resting on his mahogany desk. "Spouses who are dumped for younger, flashier models do not simply walk away. They fight for the house. They fight for the retirement accounts. They fight for the dog." "Bea is a pacifist," Arthur replied smugly, checking his Rolex. He had a lunch reservation with Victoria in 20 minutes. "She doesn't care about money. She never has. She's probably relieved to be rid of the pressure." "What did her lawyer say about the settlement offer?" Cobb opened the file, looking perplexed. "That's the thing. Her attorney, this Evelyn Carmichael woman, who operates out of a firm I've never even heard of, rejected your alimony offer." Arthur's heart skipped a beat. Panic flared. "She rejected it? Does she want more? I'm not giving her half my stock options, Cobb. Tell her—" "No, Arthur, listen to me," Cobb interrupted, raising a hand. "She didn't ask for more. She waived her right to alimony completely. She signed over her equity in the house to you. She doesn't want your retirement, your savings, or your stock options. The only thing she requested was to keep her car, her personal belongings, and full ownership of a small LLC she opened before you were married." Arthur blinked, processing the information. "Wait. She wants nothing?" "Literally nothing." "Nothing," Cobb confirmed, tossing the papers onto the desk. "She signed the final decree this morning. You're officially a single man, with all your assets entirely intact. But Arthur, I looked into that LLC. It's called Oceanside Holding. There are no public financial records, no tax returns visible on the standard databases. It's buried beneath layers of blind trusts." Arthur laughed out loud, standing up to button his suit jacket. "Oceanside Holding? Cobb, She sells handmade clay mugs at the Pike Place Market on weekends. That LLC probably has $400 in it. Don't overthink it. She's too proud to take my money, and I'm not going to complain about a clean break. The day Brianna moved out, Arthur made sure he was absent. He couldn't bear the awkwardness of watching her pack her thrifted clothes and art supplies. When he returned home that evening, the house felt remarkably light. Brianna had taken remarkably little. Her books were gone, her canvas paints were cleared from the spare room, and the Subaru was missing from the driveway. On the kitchen counter, she had left her wedding ring, a modest 2-carat princess, cut diamond he had saved for a year to buy, resting next to a single, handwritten note. Arthur, you finally have the empty canvas you always wanted. Paint whatever you like. B. Arthur tossed the note into the trash, pocketed the ring to sell later, and immediately pulled out his phone to text Victoria. It's done. She's gone. Come over. Over the next 6 months, Arthur's life transformed exactly as he had envisioned. With Brianna's modest shadow removed, he fully embraced the luxury lifestyle. He and Victoria became a power couple within Seattle's elite circles. They hosted lavish dinner parties, purchased a breathtaking penthouse overlooking Puget Sound, and began planning an extravagant $250,000 wedding in Lake Como. Professionally, Arthur was thriving, but he was hungry for the ultimate prize, the managing partner position at Blackwood and Finch. To secure it, he needed a whale, a client so massive it would cement his legacy at the firm. That whale was Helios Logistics. Helios was a multi-billion-dollar global shipping and logistics conglomerate headquartered in the Pacific Northwest. The company controlled massive supply chains, shipping fleets, and commercial real estate across the globe. For decades, it had been a privately held family empire, notoriously secretive and utterly impenetrable to outside wealth managers. However, rumors had recently swept through the financial district that the aging patriarch of the family had stepped down, passing the reins to a mysterious younger heir who was looking to diversify the family's astronomical wealth into private equity. Arthur had spent months schmoozing low-level executives at Helios, sending expensive gifts to their offices and pulling every string he had just to secure an invitation to the Apex Foundation Gala, an exclusive, invite-only philanthropic event where the new CEO of Helios Logistics was rumored to be making their first public appearance. "This is it, Victoria," Arthur said one evening, adjusting his bow tie in the mirror of their penthouse. "If I can get 5 minutes with the new Helios CEO tonight, I can pitch our asset management strategy. Jonathan Prescott told me if I land this account, the managing partner seat is mine." Victoria, stunning in a backless, emerald green silk gown, wrapped her arms around his waist and kissed his cheek. "You're going to dazzle them, darling. You were made for rooms like this, and I'll be right by your side to seal the deal." Arthur smiled, looking at their reflection. They looked wealthy, powerful, and unstoppable. It was a far cry from the faded Patagonia fleeces and missing hubcaps. He had finally curated the perfect life. He had absolutely no idea it was about to implode. The Fairmont Olympic Hotel had been transformed into a glittering palace of excess for the Apex Foundation Gala. Chandeliers dripped with crystals, waiters in white gloves circulated with trays of Dom Perignon, and the room was a sea of Seattle's most formidable power players, tech billionaires, real estate tycoons, and politicians. Arthur felt an electric buzz of adrenaline as he navigated the room with Victoria on his arm. He shook the right hands, laughed at the right jokes, and kept a predatory eye on the VIP section, waiting for the arrival of the Helios executives. "Arthur, my boy," Jonathan Prescott, the current managing partner of his firm, said, clapping him on the back. Prescott was a shrewd, intimidating man who rarely handed out compliments. "You look sharp. And Victoria, radiant as always. Are you ready for tonight, Arthur? I'm told the new head of Helios is fiercely private, but brilliant. They've completely restructured the company's European holdings in just 6 months." "I'm ready, Jonathan," Arthur replied smoothly. "I've memorized their entire global portfolio. Whatever their vision is, Blackwood and Finch is going to be the engine that drives it." "Good," Prescott nodded, taking a sip of his martini. "Because the board of directors is watching. Secure a meeting tonight, Arthur, and your future here is set in stone." At 8 o'clock, the lights dimmed, and the low murmur of the ballroom faded into a hushed, anticipatory silence. The chairman of the Apex Foundation, a venerable former senator, stepped up to the grand podium at the front of the room. "Ladies and gentlemen," the chairman's voice boomed through the speakers, "tonight we are here to celebrate unprecedented generosity. Our foundation has received a historic endowment of $50 million aimed at completely revitalizing arts and education programs across underprivileged school districts in the Pacific Northwest." A polite gasp rippled through the crowd, followed by thunderous applause. $50 million was a staggering, philanthropic flex, even for this room. Arthur applauded, leaning over to whisper to Victoria, "That's Helios money. It has to be." "As many of you know," the chairman continued, "the family behind this donation has spent generations building one of the most powerful logistics empires in the world. But they have always preferred the shadows. Tonight, however, the newly appointed CEO and majority shareholder of Helios Logistics has graciously agreed to step into the light. Please join me in welcoming a visionary leader, a dedicated educator, and a true titan of industry, Ms. Brianna Kensington." Arthur's heart completely stopped. The blood drained from his face so fast, he felt a sudden, dizzying wave of vertigo. He stared at the stage, his mind violently rejecting the name he had just heard. Brianna Kensington. Kensington. As in the Kensington Walsh shipping empire? From the velvet-draped wings of the stage, a woman emerged. Arthur's glass of champagne slipped from his fingers, hitting the carpeted floor with a muted thud. It was Bea. But it wasn't the Bea he knew. Gone were the oversized sweaters and the messy bun. She was breathtaking. She wore a custom, midnight blue Oscar de la Renta gown that cascaded around her like liquid sapphire. Her hair was styled in elegant, old Hollywood waves, and around her neck rested a diamond and sapphire collar that Arthur, even with his trained eye for luxury, knew was practically priceless. She moved with a regal, commanding grace that he had never seen before, a natural authority that commanded the absolute silence of the room. She stepped up to the podium, her hazel eyes scanning the sea of billionaires and socialites. "Thank you, Senator," Brianna said, her voice smooth, confident, and echoing with power. "For years, my family believed that wealth was a tool to be wielded quietly. I spent the last decade working as a middle school art teacher, living a very ordinary life. I did this because I wanted to understand the world without the insulation of $1 billion safety net. I wanted to know what people valued when they thought there was nothing to gain." Arthur felt as though he had been hit by a freight train. He couldn't breathe. He couldn't move. Victoria was gripping his arm, her perfectly manicured nails digging into his tuxedo jacket. "Arthur," Victoria hissed, her voice trembling. "Arthur, isn't that your ex-wife?" Arthur couldn't answer her. He just stared in absolute, paralyzing horror as Brianna continued her speech. "I learned a lot during my time living an ordinary life," Brianna said, her eyes slowly sweeping across the ballroom. And then her gaze stopped. It locked directly onto Arthur, standing frozen in the middle of the crowd. Even from 50 feet away, Arthur could see the cold, unyielding fire in her eyes. It was the same look she had given him on the day he demanded a divorce. "I learned," Brianna said softly, never breaking eye contact with him, "that many people are seduced by the illusion of success. They value the packaging over the contents. They will discard gold because it doesn't glitter loudly enough for their taste." A few chuckles rippled through the crowd, appreciating the metaphor. But Arthur felt sick to his stomach. Every word was a meticulously aimed sniper bullet. "Tonight," Brianna concluded, finally looking away from him, "Helios Logistics steps into a new era. We are looking for new partnerships, new investments, and a new vision for the future. Thank you." The ballroom erupted into a standing ovation. Jonathan Prescott was clapping enthusiastically, turning to Arthur with wide eyes. "Sterling, did you hear that?" Prescott demanded over the applause. "She's a former teacher. You used to be married to a teacher, didn't you? Get up there. Use that charm of yours. If we don't get a meeting with her by the end of the night, heads will roll." Arthur felt his knees go weak. The LLC, Oceanside Holding. It wasn't a pottery business. It was the shell company that managed the Kensington Family Trust. The Evelyn Carmichael lawyer wasn't a cheap strip mall attorney. She was likely a high-powered wealth preservation specialist. He hadn't discarded an underperforming asset. He had arrogantly thrown away the sole heiress to a multi-billion-dollar empire because she wouldn't buy a designer dress. "Arthur, move," Victoria urged, pushing him slightly from behind, her eyes wide with a mixture of shock and sheer avarice. "Go talk to her. You were married for 5 years. She owes you at least a conversation." Arthur swallowed the bile rising in his throat. He smoothed his tie with shaking hands and began to push his way through the crowd toward the VIP area, where Brianna was now surrounded by a swarm of eager executives and sycophants. He had to fix this. He had to explain himself. But as he approached the velvet ropes, guarded by 2 massive security personnel, Brianna caught his eye once more. She leaned over to the head of her security detail, whispered something, and gave Arthur one last, devastatingly polite smile before turning her back to him completely. As Arthur stepped up to the rope, the security guard stepped into his path, placing a firm, immovable hand on his chest. "I'm sorry, sir," the guard said, his voice like gravel. "Ms. Kensington has requested that we do not allow anyone from Blackwood and Finch into the private reception. You'll have to step back." Arthur stood there, surrounded by the laughing, drinking elite of Seattle, realizing with crushing clarity that he hadn't outgrown his wife. He had simply failed her test. The morning after the Apex Foundation Gala, the panoramic view of Puget Sound from Arthur's penthouse offered no comfort. The sky was the color of bruised iron, matching the heavy, sinking dread pooling in his stomach. He sat at the edge of his custom-made Italian leather sofa, staring blankly at a half-empty glass of scotch from the night before. His phone, resting on the glass coffee table, had been buzzing relentlessly since 6 a.m. Victoria paced the length of the living room, her silk robe billowing behind her. She was on the phone, speaking in hushed, frantic tones to her PR contacts, trying to do damage control. The news of Brianna Kensington's identity had already hit the morning financial blogs. The Wall Street Journal had run a front-page feature on the undercover heiress, detailing her decade-long stint as a middle school art teacher and her sudden, dramatic ascension to the throne of Helios Logistics. Nowhere in the articles was Arthur Sterling mentioned. He had been entirely scrubbed from her narrative. "It's a disaster," Victoria hissed, hanging up her phone and throwing it onto the plush rug. "The entire financial district is talking about it. Jonathan Prescott is fielding calls from clients who want to know why Blackwood and Finch was publicly humiliated by the new CEO of Helios. Do you understand what you've done, Arthur? Arthur rubbed his temples, a sharp migraine blossoming behind his eyes. What I've done? Victoria, I had no idea. She drove a car with a missing hubcap. She clipped coupons for laundry detergent. How was I supposed to know she was sitting on a multi-billion-dollar shipping empire? Victoria stopped pacing and glared at him, her perfectly arched eyebrows drawing together in a sharp V. The supportive, admiring gaze she usually reserved for him was gone, replaced by the calculating stare of a cornered predator. You were married to her for 5 years, Arthur. You shared a bed with her. You filed joint tax returns. How did you not notice a blind trust? How did you not look into Oceanside Holding when she took it in the divorce? Because she played the part perfectly, Arthur shouted, finally snapping. And because I was listening to you. You told me she was an anchor. You told me to cut her loose so we could climb faster. Victoria let out a dry, humorless laugh. Don't you dare put this on me. I told you to drop a dead-end art teacher. I didn't tell you to divorce the most powerful woman in the Pacific Northwest. You need to fix this. You need to leverage your history with her. Leverage it? Arthur stared at her in disbelief. Did you see the way she looked at me last night? She had me physically blocked by security. She's not going to take my calls. Then you go to her office, Victoria commanded, her tone turning icy. You grovel. You apologize. You play the nostalgic, heartbroken ex-husband who was just confused. I don't care what you do, Arthur, but if you don't land a meeting with her, Jonathan Prescott is going to serve your head on a silver platter. Victoria was right. 30 minutes later, Arthur's phone rang. It was Prescott's executive assistant. He was summoned to the managing partner's office immediately. When Arthur stepped into Prescott's corner office, the air was thick with tension. Prescott wasn't sitting at his mahogany desk. He was standing by the window, looking down at the Seattle traffic. He didn't turn around when Arthur entered. Sit down, Sterling, Prescott ordered, his voice dangerously quiet. Arthur took a seat in one of the wingback chairs, his heart hammering against his ribs. Jonathan, about last night. Shut up, Prescott interrupted, finally turning around. His face was a mask of barely contained fury. Do you know what happened this morning at 8:15, Arthur? The Kensington Trust, which has quietly held accounts with our firm for 3 decades, initiated a total withdrawal. Every single asset, every mutual fund, every offshore bond, gone. Transferred to Vanguard Equity. Arthur felt the blood drain from his face. Vanguard Equity was their fiercest rival. Jonathan, I can explain. My ex-wife. I know she's your ex-wife. Prescott slammed his hands down on the desk, making Arthur flinch. I had my researchers pull the public records at dawn. You divorced Brianna Kensington 6 months ago. You threw away the keys to the Helios kingdom for... What? So you could sleep with our PR director? It wasn't like that, Arthur stammered, his polished confidence entirely shattered. I didn't know who she was. She hid it from me. And that makes it worse, Prescott roared. You're a wealth manager, Arthur. Your entire job is to assess value. And you lived with a billionaire for 5 years and thought she was worthless because she shopped at thrift stores. It shows a catastrophic lack of judgment. It shows you only see the surface. Prescott straightened up, adjusting his tie with shaking hands. He took a deep, stabilizing breath. Here is the reality of your situation, Arthur. The board is in an uproar. We just lost millions in management fees because your ex-wife has a vendetta against you. You have exactly 1 week to secure a sit-down meeting with Brianna Kensington. You will apologize, you will kiss the ring, and you will convince her to halt the asset transfer. If you cannot do that, You are finished at Blackwood and Finch, and I will personally ensure that no firm on the West Coast ever hires you again." Arthur left the office feeling as though the floor had vanished beneath him. He was suffocating. He bypassed his own desk and took the elevator straight down to the parking garage. He got into his Porsche, his hands gripping the leather steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. He needed to understand why. Why had she lied? He drove to the Queen Anne district, pulling up to the small, modest house they used to share. It had been sold to a young couple, but Arthur sat idling across the street, staring at the front porch where Brianna used to sit and drink her Earl Grey tea. He pulled out his laptop and connected to his mobile hotspot. He bypassed the standard financial databases and logged into a private, encrypted investigative tool used by the firm's top-tier analysts. He searched for the Kensington family history. The patriarch, Wallace Kensington, was a notorious eccentric. He had built the shipping empire from nothing, starting with a single tugboat in the 1960s. As Arthur dug through old, archived interviews and obscure financial biographies, he found a rumor. It was a family mandate. Wallace Kensington believed that inherited wealth destroyed character. According to a leaked excerpt from his unauthorized biography, Wallace had stipulated a draconian clause for his heirs. Before taking control of the family trust or the company, the heir had to live entirely independently, strictly on an average middle-class salary for exactly 10 years. They were forbidden from touching the family money, and they were forbidden from revealing their identity to anyone outside a closed circle of legal advisors. It was a test of resilience, character, and humility. Arthur looked at the dates. Brianna had graduated from college 10 years ago this very month. The realization hit him like a physical blow to the chest. She hadn't been hiding her wealth to deceive him. She was fulfilling the terms of her inheritance. She had lived the struggle. She had genuinely loved him as an ordinary woman, hoping he loved her as an ordinary man. And he had failed the test right at the finish line. He had divorced her just 6 months before the 10-year clause expired. If he had just been patient, if he had just valued her for who she was instead of what she wore to a cocktail party, he would currently be the husband of a billionaire. He would be the king of Seattle. Instead, he was the jester who threw away the crown. Securing a meeting with the CEO of Helios Logistics through official channels proved impossible. Brianna's executive team stonewalled Arthur at every turn. His emails bounced back with automated replies, and his phone calls to the Columbia Center were politely but firmly disconnected by receptionists who clearly had his name on a blacklist. Desperation breeds ingenuity, and Arthur was nothing if not desperate. He knew Brianna's habits. He knew that despite her new billionaire status, she was fundamentally the same woman who loved local art and quiet spaces. He scoured the social calendars of every major art gallery in Seattle. On a rainy Thursday evening, he found his opening. The Luminous Gallery in Pioneer Square was hosting a private, invite-only auction to benefit underfunded public school art programs, a cause Brianna had championed when she was a teacher. Arthur pulled every favor he had left, bribing a gallery curator he had previously advised on a tax loophole just to get his name on the guest list. When Arthur arrived, the gallery was humming with low jazz and the clinking of champagne flutes. He spotted her almost immediately. Brianna was standing in front of a massive, abstract canvas holding a sparkling water. She was wearing a sharply tailored, charcoal-grey Tom Ford pantsuit, ironic, considering his past criticisms, that radiated authority. Her security detail lingered discreetly a few feet away. Arthur took a deep breath, smoothed his Xenia suit jacket, and approached her. "The brushstrokes remind me of the watercolor you painted of Mount Rainier on our honeymoon," Arthur said softly, stopping just out of arm's reach. Brianna didn't flinch. She slowly turned her head, her expression unreadable, though a flicker of cold amusement danced in her eyes. "Hello, Arthur. I was wondering how long it would take you to circumvent my receptionists. I must admit, bribing the curator was a nice touch, very on brand for you." Arthur swallowed hard, ignoring the barb. "Bea, please, I need 5 minutes. Just 5 minutes to explain." Brianna turned fully to face him. The warmth he used to see in her hazel eyes was entirely extinguished. "There is no Bea anymore, Arthur, and there is certainly nothing you need to explain. Your actions 6 months ago were remarkably articulate." "I was wrong," Arthur pleaded, lowering his voice so the nearby patrons wouldn't hear. "I was stressed, I was pressured by the firm, and I made a terrible mistake. I didn't see your true value." Brianna smiled, and it was the most terrifying thing Arthur had ever seen. It was a smile completely devoid of mercy. "Oh, Arthur, you still don't get it, do you? You're still speaking the language of transactions. You didn't see my true value because my bank account was hidden. If you had known about the money, you would have stayed. Not because you loved me, but because I was a profitable asset." "That's not true," Arthur lied, though his voice cracked slightly. "We built a life together. And you dismantled it the second you thought Victoria Ashford could offer you a better return on investment," Brianna countered smoothly. She glanced at her Patek Philippe watch. "I will give you your meeting, Arthur. Tomorrow at 10 a.m., my office. Bring Jonathan Prescott. I prefer to deliver bad news to an audience." Before Arthur could respond, she signaled her security team and walked away, leaving him standing alone in front of the abstract painting. The next morning, Arthur and a visibly sweating Jonathan Prescott stood in the hypermodern, glass-walled boardroom on the top floor of the Columbia Center. The view of the city was staggering, looking down upon the very skyscrapers Arthur used to think he conquered. At exactly 10 a.m., the double doors opened. Brianna walked in, flanked by 2 formidable-looking corporate attorneys. She took her seat at the head of the long oak table, gesturing for Arthur and Jonathan to sit. "Ms. Kensington," Jonathan Prescott began smoothly, adopting his best sycophantic tone. "Thank you for seeing us. Let me first say that the entire partnership at Blackwood and Finch extends our deepest congratulations on your ascension to CEO." "Save the pleasantries, Mr. Prescott," Brianna said, opening a sleek leather folder on the table. "You're here because you're bleeding clients, and you want to know if I'm the one holding the knife." Prescott faltered, coughing slightly. "We noticed the withdrawal of the Kensington Trust assets. We value our long-standing relationship with your family, and we believe Arthur here." "Arthur is precisely why I withdrew the assets," Brianna cut in, her gaze shifting to her ex-husband. Arthur felt pinned under a microscope. "Helios Logistics is entering a phase of aggressive expansion. We are looking for wealth management partners who possess impeccable judgment, foresight, and most importantly, loyalty. Arthur Sterling has demonstrated a profound lack of all 3. "Bea, please," Arthur interjected, his voice desperate. "You're making a business decision based on personal vindictiveness. That's not who you are." "This isn't vindictive, Arthur. It's a risk assessment," Brianna replied coldly. "You are easily manipulated by shiny objects and superficial status. You discard long-term stability for short-term gratification. You allowed a junior PR executive to convince you to blow up your marriage because she wore expensive perfume and stroked your ego. How on earth could I trust a man with such a fragile ego and poor strategic vision to manage a multi-billion-dollar portfolio?" Arthur opened his mouth, but no words came out. She had completely eviscerated him, using his own corporate logic against him. Brianna turned back to Jonathan Prescott. "Blackwood and Finch is a dinosaur, Mr. Prescott. You promote men like Arthur because they look the part, completely ignoring the rot beneath the floorboards. I am transferring the entirety of the Helios global portfolio to Vanguard Equity. Their CEO, Simon Frost, understands that true value isn't always screaming for attention." Prescott's face turned the color of chalk. Losing the Kensington Trust was bad. Losing the entire Helios expansion contract to Vanguard was catastrophic. "However," Brianna continued, closing the leather folder with a decisive snap, "I am not entirely uncharitable. I recently acquired a controlling stake in the commercial real estate holding company that owns your office building, Mr. Prescott." Arthur's stomach dropped into free fall. "I have decided not to terminate your lease," Brianna said, standing up. The meeting was over. "But I am raising the rent by 40%. I suggest you find areas to trim the fat in your budget, starting with your bloated senior director salaries. Have a good day, gentlemen." She walked out of the boardroom without looking back. The elevator ride down was silent. Prescott didn't say a word to Arthur. He didn't have to. The moment they reached the lobby, Prescott turned to him, his eyes dead. "Clear out your desk by noon, Sterling. You're done." Arthur walked out onto the rain-slicked streets of Seattle, his world completely shattered. When he finally returned to the penthouse, it was empty. Victoria's clothes were gone from the closet. Her expensive perfumes were missing from the vanity. On the kitchen island, resting precisely where Brianna had left her wedding ring 6 months prior, was a handwritten note from Victoria. "Arthur, I need a partner who understands the altitude. You're in freefall. V." Arthur collapsed onto a bar stool, the silence of the massive, expensive penthouse deafening. He had chased the illusion of success so fiercely that he had run straight off a cliff. He had traded gold for brass, and now he was entirely bankrupt in every way that mattered. The unspooling of Arthur Sterling's life did not happen in slow motion. It happened with the terrifying, instantaneous velocity of a severed elevator cable. Within 48 hours of his termination, his corporate credit cards were frozen. Within a week, the HR department at Blackwood and Finch sent a courier to collect his company-leased Porsche 911. By the end of the month, the eviction notice for the Lake Como wedding venue arrived, accompanied by a letter from Victoria's lawyers demanding he cover the non-refundable deposit they had signed for together. Jonathan Prescott was a man of his word. Arthur was blacklisted. Every phone call he made to rival firms, boutique agencies, and even mid-tier wealth management groups in Portland and San Francisco ended the exact same way. A polite but icy rejection. In the insular, gossip-fueled world of high finance, no one wanted to hire the man who had personally insulted and alienated the most liquid billionaire on the West Coast. He was radioactive. Arthur was forced to break the lease on his penthouse, forfeiting a massive security deposit. He sold his Tom Ford suits to high-end consignment shops, hawked his Rolex to a jeweler in Bellevue, and liquidated his personal investment portfolios just to cover his mounting legal and living expenses. The irony was suffocating. He was meticulously dismantling the very life he had destroyed his marriage to build. He eventually found a cramped, one-bedroom apartment in a run-down brick building in Bremerton, a gritty shipyard city a ferry ride away from the glittering Seattle skyline he used to dominate. The floors slanted, the radiator hissed like an angry serpent, and the only view from his single window was a brick alleyway lined with overflowing dumpsters. For the first 3 months, Arthur drowned in a toxic cocktail of bitterness and scotch. He blamed Brianna. He blamed Victoria. He blamed Jonathan Prescott. He spent his days sitting on a cheap, second-hand sofa, glaring at the peeling paint on the ceiling, fantasizing about a miraculous comeback that would prove them all wrong. But the scotch ran out, and so did his savings. Hunger and the threat of imminent homelessness have a unique way of burning away a man's pride. One rainy Tuesday, Arthur walked into a small, independent community credit union in South Seattle. The linoleum floors were scuffed, the fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, and the clientele consisted of exhausted nurses, shipyard workers, and single mothers clutching handfuls of bills. The branch manager was a stern, grey-haired man named Nathaniel Reed, who reviewed Arthur's glittering resume with deep skepticism. "You managed multi-million-dollar international portfolios," Nathaniel noted, tapping a cheap ballpoint pen against the desk. "You were a senior director at Blackwood. Why are you sitting in my office applying for a low-level loan officer position that pays $45,000 a year?" Arthur looked down at his hands. He was wearing an off-the-rack suit that didn't quite fit right anymore, having lost 15 pounds from stress. He thought about lying. He thought about spinning a tale of wanting a lifestyle change or giving back. But he was so profoundly tired of the hustle. "Because I made a catastrophic mistake of character," Arthur said, his voice quiet but remarkably steady. "I lost my job, I lost my reputation, and I lost my marriage because I valued the wrong things. No one else in this city will hire me, Mr. Reed. But I know numbers. I know how to structure debt, and I know how to balance a ledger. If you give me this desk, I will work harder for your clients than anyone else you could hire." Nathaniel studied him for a long, uncomfortable moment. Then he tossed a stack of disorganized files across the desk. "These are local families facing foreclosure. The banks are trying to bleed them dry with variable interest rates. See if you can restructure their debt and keep them in their homes. You start tomorrow at 8. Don't be late, Sterling." Arthur's new reality was a brutal, humbling shock to his system. There were no Michelin-starred lunches or exclusive galas. His days were spent poring over the chaotic finances of ordinary people, people who were drowning in medical debt, predatory car loans, and exorbitant credit card interest. At first, he hated it. It felt like a punishment. But slowly, imperceptibly, something inside him began to shift. When he managed to consolidate the debt of an elderly widow, saving her family home from the bank, she brought him a homemade apple pie and cried in his office. When he helped a young mechanic secure a small business loan to open his own garage, the man shook Arthur's hand with a fierce, genuine gratitude that no tech billionaire had ever shown him. Arthur began to see the world without the distorting lens of corporate ambition. He bought a battered, 10-year-old Honda Civic with a dent in the rear bumper. He started shopping at the local discount grocery store, clipping coupons out of the Sunday paper just to make his modest salary stretch. One evening, while standing in the checkout line, holding a generic brand of laundry detergent, he suddenly thought of Brianna. He remembered the way she used to mend her clothes. He remembered her quiet contentment. He finally understood that she wasn't hiding from the world. She was anchoring herself to what was real. She had wanted to know that she could survive without the illusion of wealth. Arthur went home to his dark, cramped apartment, sat on his second-hand sofa, and wept. Not out of self-pity, or because he had lost his millions. He wept because, for the first time in his life, he truly realized the magnitude of what he had thrown away. He had traded a woman of immeasurable substance for a world made entirely of glass. 3 years later, the Apex Foundation's annual grant review was held not in a glittering ballroom, but in the sterile, brightly lit conference center of the Seattle Public Library. The foundation had launched an aggressive new initiative aimed at funding grassroots financial literacy and debt relief programs for lower-income communities. Arthur, now 37, sat in the uncomfortable plastic chairs of the waiting area. He was the director of community outreach for the South Seattle Credit Union. Nathaniel Reed had promoted him after Arthur single-handedly saved over 200 local families from bankruptcy. Today, Arthur was pitching for a $2 million grant that would allow them to open 3 new branches in underserved neighborhoods. He was wearing a simple, well-ironed gray suit. His face had deeper lines, and there was a touch of silver at his temples, but his eyes were clear and grounded. He carried a worn leather briefcase containing his proposal. "Mr. Sterling," an assistant called out, "the board is ready for you." Arthur stood up, took a deep breath, and walked into the conference room. A panel of 5 foundation executives sat behind a long table, but the center seat was occupied by the chairwoman of the Apex Foundation, Brianna Kensington. She looked as regal and imposing as the night of the gala. She wore a pristine white blazer, her hair pulled back into a severe, elegant knot. When Arthur walked in, a brief, imperceptible flicker of surprise crossed her features, but she quickly masked it with a professional, impassive stare. Arthur's heart gave a heavy, painful thump, but he didn't falter. He didn't look away, nor did he shrink. He approached the podium, opened his briefcase, and began his presentation. He didn't use corporate buzzwords. He didn't talk about ROI or market share. He spoke about the widow who almost lost her home. He spoke about the mechanic who needed a $5,000 lifeline. He laid out the grim mathematics of poverty, showing exactly how predatory lending trapped families in generational cycles of debt. He explained how his credit union used empathy-driven restructuring to break those cycles. "We aren't just managing money," Arthur concluded, his voice ringing with a conviction he had never possessed in his past life. "We are managing human dignity. We are giving people the breathing room they need to rebuild. A $2 million injection won't just balance our ledgers. It will save 300 homes this year." The room was silent. The board members furiously took notes. Brianna leaned forward, resting her chin on her steepled fingers. Her hazel eyes, sharp and assessing, locked onto Arthur. "It is a compelling presentation, Mr. Sterling," Brianna said, her voice echoing slightly in the large room. "The numbers are solid. The community impact is undeniable. However, your personal resume is complicated. You spent the prime of your career servicing the ultra-wealthy, maximizing profits at the expense of the working class. You were known for a rather ruthless, self-serving ambition. Why should this board believe that this sudden pivot to community service is anything more than a desperate man's attempt to rehabilitate his image?" It was a direct hit. The other board members shifted uncomfortably. Arthur didn't flinch. He looked directly into the eyes of the woman he had profoundly wronged. "You shouldn't believe it blindly, Ms. Kensington," Arthur answered softly, the absolute truth stripping away any need for defense. "You are entirely correct. For a very long time, I was arrogant, superficial, and blind to the actual value of the people around me. I chased an illusion of success and destroyed my own life in the process. I lost everything, and I deserved to lose it." He paused, his hands gripping the edges of the podium. "But stripping away that illusion forced me to see what happens when the money runs out. I didn't take this job to rehabilitate my image. I took it because I needed to survive. And in the process of surviving, I learned how to actually be of use to someone other than myself. I cannot change the man I was, but I can point to the 300 families who still have a roof over their heads today because of the man I am trying to be." Brianna held his gaze for a long, heavy moment. The silence in the room stretched until it felt fragile enough to shatter. Finally, she lowered her hands and looked down at his proposal. "Thank you, Mr. Sterling. The board will be in touch." Arthur nodded respectfully, packed up his briefcase, and walked out. He felt a strange, profound sense of peace. He had faced his greatest regret, and he had not hidden from his own truth. 2 days later, Nathaniel Reed called Arthur into his office. The credit union had received the grant, all $2 million. That evening, as Arthur was walking to his dented Honda Civic in the rainy parking lot, a sleek, black Maybach pulled up to the curb. The rear window rolled down smoothly. Brianna was sitting in the back, bathed in the soft, amber glow of the streetlights. Arthur stopped. He didn't approach the car, simply waiting in the drizzle. "The board was impressed with your metrics," Brianna said, her tone devoid of the icy hostility from 3 years ago. It was calm, measured, and perhaps a little curious. "Your restructuring model is highly efficient." "Thank you," Arthur replied. "The funding will change a lot of lives in this neighborhood." Brianna looked at him, really looked at him. She took in his worn coat, the exhaustion around his eyes, and the quiet, unshakable humility that had replaced his swagger. "You've changed, Arthur," she said quietly. It wasn't a compliment, nor was it an accusation. It was simply an observation of fact. "I had to," he said, offering a small, self-deprecating smile. The altitude was killing me. A faint ghost of a smile touched Brianna's lips. She looked down at her hands, then back up to him. "My grandfather used to say that some people only learn the value of a foundation after the house burns down. Take care of that money, Mr. Sterling. Do good work." "I will, Miss Kensington. I promise you that." The window rolled up, and the Maybach pulled smoothly away into the Seattle night. Arthur stood in the rain for a moment, watching the red taillights disappear. He knew there would be no grand reconciliation. There was no fairy tale ending where the billionaire forgave the ex-husband and welcomed him back into the fold. The damage he had done was permanent. But as Arthur unlocked his rusted car and slid into the cold driver's seat, he didn't feel despair. He turned the key, listening to the engine sputter before humming to life. He had lost a fortune, an empire, and a woman he had never fully understood. But in the wreckage of his ambition, he had finally salvaged the one thing he couldn't buy: himself. Arthur's story serves as a stark, dramatic exploration of the tension between superficial ambition and authentic value. In his relentless pursuit of status and wealth, Arthur became blind to the profound worth of the woman standing right in front of him, mistaking quiet humility for a lack of drive. His downfall was swift, complete, and entirely of his own making, highlighting the fragile nature of a life built purely on corporate optics and social climbing. However, the narrative ultimately reveals that true character is often forged in the fires of ruin. By losing the billionaire empire he so desperately coveted, Arthur was forced to strip away his arrogant facade and rebuild a life rooted in genuine service and self-awareness. It is a reminder that the most valuable assets we possess cannot be measured in stock options, but in our capacity for growth, accountability, and the quiet dignity of doing real good.